Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Lake. I'm going to be facilitating the webinar. The webinar that you're in is Procuring for Agile, our thoughts on what good looks like, which is a follow-on from our white paper, which is available on the APM website. We've got a team of presenters here who will be able to go through each section of the white paper. So we will be covering each section of the white paper that we've written in sections through the slides. I think we first would like to just go over the agenda. As I've said earlier, it follows the order of the recently published white paper. There are some key points in the slide set we're presenting. We try not to regurgitate the text, so people will be talking about their own experiences and some background that we know of. So who are we? Well, we'll ask the presenters to introduce themselves. I'll prompt that. I'm John Lake. I'm the secretary of the APM Contracts and Procurements Specific Interest Group. Done a lot of projects in my time, and I'm still doing projects now, so I'm pleased to be able to supply some insight into the real world on those. John, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name's Dr. John Broome. I'm chair of the SIG. I'm also a trustee director of the Association for Project Management and have my own company, Leading Edge Projects Consulting Limited, through which I advise on contracting arrangements and issues for typically complex projects and programs ranging from a couple of million up to my largest was £16.5 billion.
And Jason, would you like to follow on?
Yes, I'm Jason Sprague. I'm a managing consultant for ASC Consulting, a GemServe company. My area of interest is large-scale transformation, which isn't just about delivering projects, but about changing the organization around the projects that it's delivering. So it's a fascinating challenge of change of people as well as change of outcome.
Thank you, Jason. And Olubukola, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a member of the APM Contracts and Procurement Specific Interest Group. I'm a committee member, and I've worked in projects with experience working in central government in the United Kingdom for over 16 years. This is an opportunity to really talk about what procuring for agile contracts is, and I'm looking forward to engaging. Thank you.
Thank you, Olubukola. And Will, would you like just to introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Will Webster. I'm the head of IT at APM. I've been there, I think it's about a year today or tomorrow, actually. I've been in IT for 20 years, and much of that has been in and around project delivery.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone. Over to John Broome. Could you go through your reasons, or the reasons why we wrote this paper, and give us some background on a few slides? Thank you.
Yeah, well, actually, John, the inspiration from my perspective, the original inspiration was actually a talk you gave probably 3-4 years ago based on research on how Agile had been procured and contracted from your research. And essentially you said it's either price-based or time and materials. And I, coming from my world, which is predominantly construction, but lots of other sectors mixed in as well, I thought that, well, there's an awful lot of other procurement and contracting routes out of that. I suppose the bigger picture was that in the SIG teleconference, when it's raised, that people said, hang on, the big bang approach to project delivery is not working so well as it used to, due to a whole host of stuff like technology on a long project. Technological developments happen over the course of that project. So if you stick with the existing technology, you end up with an out-of-date project. User requirements change over the duration of a project. So what they originally specified they want, they don't want now, or it's changed. And people want benefits delivered earlier and progressively. So what happened was we held a big workshop early last year, got lots of info, examples and insights from 27 participants, and collected that data. 7 of us then formed a working group to develop the white paper. 3 of them were from an IT background and had been involved in full-on agile projects. So that was you, John, Graham and Kevin. 4 of us were from outside IT and had other experience around that. So why the need for a white paper? Well, traditional legal drafting likes certainty with everything defined and tied down. And you could argue traditional technical drafting requires that as well. So procurement likes to go into contract also with a fixed price, but if you know things will change significantly during the contract, that fixed price is just an illusion, quite frankly. And if you set up and run your contract and hence your project thinking this is it, this is the fixed price, it must be maintained at all costs, when things are quite obviously changing around you, then you're resisting and fighting that change, and you're on the back foot rather than managing that change in a controlled way. In addition, the world is not just IT, is moving too fast for that illusion of certainty to persist. So the world often does not fit the traditional legal and procurement, and as I said, probably traditional technical drafting way of doing things. So if we next slide, that is reflected in this. So this, as a director of the APM, one of the subgroups I sit on is the Projecting the Future subgroup. And that is scanning ahead for the long-term trends which will affect project management. And if you go down to commercial stroke procurement line, so that's about the 7th line down, is that right? You've got, you're getting away from that big bang and into the experimental and incremental, and that's essentially agile, or an agile type delivery. And you can see other things around there which will come into play later on. Next slide, John. So other trends that we're aware of, move towards benefits and outcome-based contracting. So people have projects not to deliver something, a physical thing or a bit of software. They want projects delivered for a benefit or an outcome. And contracts are increasingly including measures in them to reflect that, either partially or wholly. You are rewarded on the benefits or the outcome. And also what we've seen is a move towards greater collaboration, and within that, longer term relationships. Because if I want you to collaborate, yeah, I've got an organization which functions in a certain way, uses certain processes, has a certain culture, etc. A transactional nature where you appoint me for each small project just ain't gonna cut it. You've got all this learning to happen behind it. So you're going to move towards collaboration. And also, if you're going to add to previous projects that you've already done, it's going to be a longer term relationship. And quite frankly, longer term relationships aren't going to survive if the contracting organization, or for that client organization, isn't getting what they want from the relationship. So that needs to be reflected in, ultimately, win-win commercial and hence contractual relationships. So if, as an example, I am constantly deducting points and therefore revenue from you because you're not meeting my high, inappropriate, ever-changing targets, then I will be losing money, and then I will not want to work with you. In fact, what will happen is I'll hide poor performance, and then we'll have an argument about why that poor performance occurred in order to avoid liability. So that's a trend which is happening generally. What I would stress is Agile is not collaboration. collaboration is perhaps a prerequisite for Agile to work, but Agile has its 10 principles, it has numerous methodologies. Okay, next slide, John.
Next slide. So some caveats, John. I gather that you stated some caveats up front in the white paper.
Yeah, and the reason for this was we wanted to address things which possibly people could criticize us for if we didn't do it up front. So first thing which emerged from that initial workshop was people gave us lots of our examples where outside of IT where Agile could be used. And in fact, I remember in that workshop, lots of light bulbs went off in my mind where I was saying, hang on, I've done something like that in construction or other sectors, mining, for instance. So it's not just for IT projects. If you're an Agile junkie there's lots of Agile methodologies out there. We're not concerned with any particular methodology. Particularly when Olubukola comes to explaining her slide, if you like, we're for projects which have Agile characteristics, not full-on Agile. One of the criticisms of Agile is that, which I don't think is fully valid if you go back to the original literature, is, oh, you abandon good project management and just get in a room and get on with it. Absolutely not. We actually think that in certain aspects you've got to have slicker program management so that the backlog of projects can be put in place promptly. So the client decides that dialogue around what's the best project in terms of outcomes to be done, is it ready to be done, and doing that slickly so that the supplier can utilize their resource without gaps. We're also not going to be arrogant enough to assume that you have to have Agile contracts, as we're proposing, for Agile to work. Clearly that's not the case, just that they're more likely to work far better if it's in alignment, in harmony with the contract and procurement arrangements, rather than you're fighting against it.
Excellent. So I think that leads us on to how you start the process and whether you should, whether you should enter into agility into your contracts. So I'd like to ask Jason now. I'll bring up your next slide, Jason, and maybe you could tell us a bit more about that.
Thanks, John. Let me set the scene a little bit, because we have methodologies, and all of our organizations, be they small or large, adhere to that methodology loosely or tightly. There tends to be a correlation with the larger the organization, the more tightly they hold to a set way of doing things. This does begin, if the organization isn't doing it, completely changing things. So in the provider selection space, the question is, are you capable? Going back to Dr. Broome's discussion of the illusion of uncertainty, we know that our project methodologies can say, we started with these requirements and we're going to deliver these requirements. And we aren't being able to leverage, realistically, the third-party knowledge that we look to bring in by buying that input. Because many times our provider, the person is coming from outside of our project that we're generally paying for an outcome for, is integral in adding not just some effort or actual product itself, physical thing, but knowledge as well. Key to all of this, before jumping in, is understanding that you can that your governance and decision making is paramount, and getting everyone on board. So a mistake that I've made in the past is that you start a project that seeks to do the methodology of a new methodology, in this case, an agile procurement, while you're using the project to change the organization. And this means that you're hitting a whole barrier of resistance, and your legal teams aren't on board. Your commercial team says, whoa, this is the way we do things here. So just a word to the wise, be sure that the legal team, the existing procurement team, they're tightly integrated. Of course, we all say good project practice is, strong stakeholder engagement. I don't mock that in any way, shape, or form. But this is about creating a program of change that enables agile procurement or procurement in agile projects, and that begins to address some major issues such as risk appetite and the actual methodology, your gates for decision making. So what can become uncomfortable is then in that decision-making process, including someone from outside of your organization. And in my past experience, I've seen this be challenged by my legal teams who say, whoa, I want the outcome, here's the outcome, the commercial guy wants the outcome, but why in the world are we including people that are sort of outside the camp, shall we say? So the skills and culture thing, I can't stress how important these are. And if you're looking at changing the processes, my advice would be start with a project that is looking to prototype it, even go so far as to run a mock project and talk about the what if scenarios. We're looking at lessening failure. So the whole purpose of doing this is so that our projects deliver more successfully on time and get the outcome required with the best knowledge and input from all stakeholders. So we're looking to have tight, iterative, clear decision making and top-down support. So you're going to change your cadence. You're going to bring that supplier in, and you're going to have to begin to frame the conversation about how closely do we want our third party and how comfortable we are holding certain types of risk. That'll be imperative for framing the work that comes later. A key mistake that I, as a person that delivers change, continue to make and learn from is that this takes constant discussion with our leadership teams and with our non-project teams about how we are going to have multiple methodologies and how we are going to bring together and try to fail fast. This is the idea that we want to learn as quickly as possible, do it collaboratively, reduce people's risk on both our supplier forms so that the example that John offered in his opening doesn't happen, where we're not creating difficult relationships down the road where the cost of change costs us an excellent supply chain. So that's what I have to share, John, and
Okay.
That's where I would start.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Jason. So what we also now need to look at is, John mentioned about there being a spectrum of projects on a waterfall/agile scale, and there could be some what we might call puritanical view of what agile is and is not. So how do we determine if our project, the procurement we need to go into, is actually going to be helped by a proper and agile approach? Olubukola.
Yes, so looking through the table we've shared on the slide, we first of all thought about looking at what is relevant to the contract and the key features of the contract that will need to be addressed in development. We also addressed in the guide what's to address when developing the selection strategy for the contract. In terms of what we're looking at, so the spectrum between traditional and agile, and also to think about what exactly are we trying to deliver in terms of the contract? How are we going to use the contract to get the need we want for the project? Is the contract going to deliver change, the ongoing business for improvements? And I have an example that I'd share, like in a project that I delivered with, which was part of a suite of projects within the change program. It was a data migration project involving stakeholders, staff, the suppliers within the government framework for procurement and contracts. We thought about what's the impact of the change and how the contract would suit the project. And we defined the high-level outcomes and the benefits at the outset. So we didn't have a precisely defined output as you have in a traditional spectrum. We also thought about how we continue to engage our stakeholders through meetings, workshops, to understand what exactly the contract is meant to deliver and what would need to include in the contract. The contracts also, in terms of thinking agile, we had a plan, and we also thought about the risks. So what risk do we have with delivering the contract? And we kind of like looked at the RAG rating, will it be read, and how, in terms of our engagement, in terms of what we need, in terms of costs, in terms of timing, all that was included as a plan. And we progressively deliver the outputs to measure what we had agreed in the contract. Also, thinking about how the joint thinking with stakeholders across the piece, the what's, the whys, and the hows, and stimulating and encouraging a test and learn environment across the piece, stakeholders, suppliers, contract manager, the project manager. And we kind of looked at the time frame in terms of the sprints and the tasks and how they're likely to last. In this case, we're working within weeks to months. And also, we thought about checking the outputs in the contract against realistic and expected benefits to be delivered. In terms of resources, that remained fairly constant over a period of time, and that was fed from feedback on how and what the output was delivered and how we can incorporate that into sprints within the contract. Also, in terms of the resource, we, as I said, it remained fairly stable over the period of time because we continue to work with the same stakeholders. We continue to discuss, review our thinking. And as John said earlier, collaborative working, of course, helps with the contracts arrangements. Overall, when we looked at the spectrum, technical change did not really affect what we were trying to deliver for the project in terms of the contract, but we're constantly open to constraints across the piece where in terms of regulation, access, and we continue to monitor evolving risk, looking at the opportunities, looking at how to mitigate against the risk. And overall, the delivery of the project fell within the agile spectrum, with the majority of the scores tending towards the 4, totaling now an overall score of about 39, which worked well for the level of the scale of change that the project was going to deliver within the contract, the security and the safety of data transfers.
Thank you, Bukola. And as you can see from the slide, there are a number of factors to consider. And in fact, what you can do is put a weighting on these in order to give you some idea how close you might be. We thought this could be a way of working on that part of what's required. So thank you, Bukola. That's very good. So we're going to go back to John now. We talk about what an agile contract should actually look like in practice. Obviously, procurement, there's a thing called most economically advantageous tender. That can come into factors, and it's important that you get the right supplier. So I'm going to, John.
Okay. So yeah, this is a bit of a run through of these. We sort of sat down and we discussed various features, and I think we ended up with 13 or 14 of most likely features, and rationalised them down from our initial list to what does it look like. So here's our top 10, rightly or wrongly, which we've sort of arranged, yeah, in a logical sequence, hopefully. So the first thing is we think that if you're going to enter into a long-term collaborative relationship, you really need to have an element of co-designing the contract under which you're going to work. Now that could start just at testing the market. This is what we're thinking of. What's your feedback? It could happen. So that's part of the PQQ, pre-qualification questionnaire. It could happen after you've pre-qualified people down. And it could happen at the final negotiation stage, depending upon when you want to bring them in, and it could happen at all of them. Perhaps a really defining characteristic is that you're actually focusing, the contract, if you like, focuses on how it will be delivered, not what will be delivered. Yes, it'll be in the area of a sector or whatever, But actually the whole point of Agile is you don't really necessarily know exactly what's going to be delivered. So you can't define the what to get the illusion of certainty of a fixed price. So what's the contract need to focus on? It needs to focus on how you are going to work to deliver and do good project management, etc., to deliver the what which will emerge. Each sprint is instructed as a task, not a new contract. So what you sometimes see in frameworks is you have a framework contract, and then each new contract, each new deliverable is a separate contract. That means that you need to sign a new contract. That means that there's going to be a lot more governance, including directors of the company signing the contract off. What we suggest is that you have a base contract, and then each task or sprint in Agile terminology is instructed under that same contract. So there's not a new contract, and that should enable you to get that continuity of tasks as time progresses. That's not to say you shouldn't have good governance in place, etc., but it needs to be slick governance. But in terms of the mechanics of getting a new contract in place, you're avoiding that. That contract describes the standard technical management and administrative requirements with only the specifics in the task order. So you don't want each task order to be hundreds of pages long. And hidden within there are the few specifics of that specific task. So just to give an example, I'm the framework advisor for Connect Plus, who maintain the M25. It used to be that every single £1 million, let's say on average, renewal contract was a separate contract, and it was 250 pages, of which perhaps at most 20-30 pages was unique to that contract. We've got that down to about 30-40 pages, and what we're aiming to do, or now we let it as an annual contract with individual tasks, if you like, within it. Each task, the standard stuff, is about 40 pages, including drawings, and we're aiming to get it down to a couple of drawings, basically. 5, conditions of contract can't be changed except by a deed of variation or supplementary agreement where the directors sign it to say we're changing it. But you could have a lot of the detail in the requirement lower down, which can be changed by an instruction from the client or the project manager or the contract administrator. So we suggest that the detail that you have is actually in that more technical management administrative requirement document, because then it can be changed as the project evolves. And that does include the base technical requirements, not of each individual task, but what each task has to comply with. Because again, technology changes. So you might say, actually, we don't want to do it in accordance with that standard. We want to do it in accordance with that standard from now on. And within that technical requirement or the requirement document, it's a phrase which I've used in Agile, heard used in Agile. It's just sufficient to provide a framework, but not over prescriptive to stifle innovation and creativity. So you don't want to sign the contract and everybody gets in the room and goes, okay, we've got to do Agile. How the hell do we do that? Or I think Agile means this, or no, I think it means that, and so on. You want to give people a framework to operate, both in terms of organizational structure, IT systems communicating with each other, etc., and so on. But you want that detail, that way of working to emerge and to be able to evolve, and without everything having to be changed under, if you like, 5 by an instruction from the client. What this means is, because if you can't define the what at the start of the contract, well, actually, payment is predominantly going to be based on input costs. That might mean each task is built up from input costs, as in what's the cost of this resource, but it will be supplemented by performance measures. So to give an example of a project I was involved in New Zealand to transform the operation of a New Zealand coal mine, Basically, the management team of a big Australian miner was brought in. They were paid for at cost, but the money was in the improvements that were made in the operation of that mine. Okay, and the emphasis there, Nate, is on carrots, not sticks. All the research that I looked at years ago when I did my postdoc research, all my experience suggests, and the experience of other people, is that if you just use deductions and damages, etc., what you do is you encourage hiding of problems and therefore encourage blame. The reason I didn't achieve this level was because of you, and you do that to avoid liability. And a quote from someone when we were doing this was, "A lack of sticks enables teams to fail fast and openly and then move on." And that's what you want. If a sprint doesn't work or doesn't hit what you want to do in terms of the positive outcome, what you do is that's a new sprint later on. It's not a, right, okay, I'm not accepting that, I'm deducting stuff, etc. and so on. Obviously a blatant fail, that's different, but if it doesn't quite hit the mark. And if you look at all of that, everything about that we talked about suggests that actually the provider you enter into contract with is providing a service. They're not providing a product, if you like. And this is where the legal departments, etc., might go, oh, no, I'm not quite sure about this. But that implies that liability is on a reasonable skill and care basis. If you insist on fitness for purpose, as a client, you will have to get what each sprint or task is going to be much more defined. The provider, before taking on and accepting that task, will have to do much more due diligence about what that is, that purpose is, and be much more confident that they can achieve it before they accept that. And all that will mean that there's a lot of negotiation, etc., and so on, before they actually get on and do the task. And that will mean resources lying around, do nothing, being brought in, being brought out, etc., and so on. And that will just undermine the effectiveness of it. So legally, yes, you want to fit for purpose, but what you actually want is you actually want something delivered which is just sufficient or more for its purpose. And a presumption in the contracts is that the how is based on collaboration with a presumption of trust. So there's a presumption that you are going to appoint competent people and that they can do a good job. There's a presumption that they will do their best to deliver what they want and tell you if there are problems so you can do something about it. And there is a presumption of empathy, so that you will give me honest advice, you will take into account my view, and we will come up with the best for us solution, rather than I will beat you over a stick. And I think all of those points are mutually reinforcing. Above all, a lack of trust just means more administration and defensive behaviours. So with that, I've said my bit.
Thank you very much, John. That's great. So the next part is we're going to go over to Jason. So Jason, for example, on major contracts, preparing the contract itself can be a project. What is your slant on this? And here's your slide.
It's a significant thing. So John just spent his time discussing what does a contract look like. My opening remarks and Olubukola's opening remarks says, you just don't do this. There has to be significant preparation. It's a no-brainer. You start with your stakeholders, you start with your leadership teams, and hopefully you've done the work to build and test the process changes appropriately that you need to, because that's going to be contractualized. Going back to John's comments about building a contract that's flexible by having task orders or call off or whatever terminology you wish to use against an established contract that says, what are we doing and why are we doing it? You're going to have a negotiation early and often about your success criteria. So the easy success criteria is that you get the outcome that you started with, but the reason we're doing agile and not the traditional 5-gate method of and creating and not really engaging with our suppliers until we've made all of our decisions is that we want to learn, and there needs to be an emphasis on learning, and that's going to inform our success criteria. we're going to have a pretty good idea how to incentivize good behavior. Let's not be naive and assume that the third party will be benevolent and aren't profit motivated. They want to do just the right amount of effort at the right amount of time, at the right time to get their outcome, to get your outcome, and everyone is happy. So I highlight the methods. You don't want to go the other way where you are so collaborative that you build in cost. And when you contractualize your agile methods, it will probably be different contract to contract depending on the size, but will be largely against that culture that you've built within your organization that adheres as close as you can to give confidence to senior leadership. Hence going back to putting senior leadership, which are key stakeholders at the center of your project. So there are a few more points that ownership is a big deal. So with any project manager, with any project team, they wish to have a reasonable amount of control over delivering that. If you water down that control by removing both the ability to customize the agile process, being dogmatic again, and contractualizing it in that master contract that doesn't allow them to modify and build a collaborative project team, you're going to limit your benefits of that contract. And of course, I think a key thing is that we don't do enough to bring people in, either paying them, and it could be your supplier, it could be somebody else, but bringing them in as subject matter experts to test the decision making. And as we've highlighted, it's about a service, not necessarily about a tangible outcome. And that paying for insight makes us go faster, although at the time we are thinking, oh my goodness, we're doing more talking and all we do is go through our sprints and talk. There has to be, going back to point number 3 of establishing your success criteria, you need to determine how you'll make a decision, how you'll close that down, and how you'll go on to actually delivering the task. Not simple, not easy, and not quick, but you have to start that thinking well before you delve in. And many of your T's and C's that exist on your contracts do have a lot of that already spelled out. So, John, I could continue on, but I leave it with give people control and put the stakeholder into it. And then we go into figuring out how to work together.
Oh, thank you, Jason. That's great. We'll move on now, and I can introduce to you Will Webster, who has introduced himself a bit earlier, who is head of IT from the APM and recently completed a successful procurement on an agile provider. Over to you, Will.
Okay, thanks, John. And yeah, really just to set the scene for this, my background is entirely IT, so I can only really talk about agile in that context. I'd be remiss to pretend to know anything about agile in any other industries. But so the background to this is that we were procuring a new digital agency, services very much focused on web design and development. And this was very much in the knowledge that knowing that what we wanted to be delivered today is going to be very different to what we want 1 or 2 years from now. And that's the very nature of digital. We took a very traditional waterfall type RFP approach to it at the beginning. We had a big laundry list of business requirements, and we did have a product vision, but it was somewhat buried amongst everything else. And certainly a lesson from this for me has definitely been to scale down the Moscow and focus much more on the drivers and vision in this kind of a tender. So what you're really looking for is a partner that understands your business drivers. You're not, as people have mentioned already on this webinar, you're not buying a commodity, you're buying people. So at the time, we didn't even know that actually we were procuring a supplier who was going to work agile. We could probably have guessed it if we'd done that level of thinking up front. So again, that's another lesson to take away. Think not only about what you're buying, but how you expect it will be delivered and whether that does need to influence the decision making or not. So we shortlisted down to 3 suppliers, then took time to meet with each of them to really understand in a lot more detail how we would work together. So they'd already had our requirements, but this is about, you know, testing the relationship, testing how Agile is going to work. With the successful agency, it was really clear how they would work. Their Agile process was documented in their response, and it would later be documented actually in the contract. And we explored the mechanics of their particular brand of Agile, and believe me, everyone has a slightly different flavour to it. We went through how we'd manage things like roadmap planning, requirements analysis, release management, integration, support, etc. And we explored, and this is a really important point, we explored in detail the roles and responsibilities needed on both sides to make this project a success. And it did highlight a number of areas where we thought we may have been ready for Agile, but actually internally we still needed a bit more work. And I've heard some people refer to this RFP process these days as more of a request for partner, and I think that does sum it up quite well. Unfortunately, I don't think the world of procurement has quite caught up with that yet. One of the areas we explored was around how to measure progress. And I think what you're looking for from an Agile organisation is that good ones are very transparent. And this one, for us, they explained that we would have access to all the same tools that they used to deliver our change. And it needs to work both ways. We provide them with as much knowledge as we're able to, as much insight to be prepared for what changes we have coming up in the future. Of course, the best measure of their performance is those incremental improvements to whatever product is being developed. And success in Agile is measured by that delivery of business value, which isn't always the easiest thing to measure. But that's kind of something to think about there. After all of this, we were still nervous about how APM, as a reasonably traditional organisation, would support Agile working, and the level of investment with an organisation we didn't know that well. The costs were actually clear and fixed. The nervousness was much more around not having that defined scope that we could hold the supplier to account for. So we needed to feel more confident about this supplier. So this may be something that you think of doing yourselves, or you kind of jump in with both feet. But for us, what we wanted to do is sign up to a smaller discovery project, which had clear deliverables and was to give us a flavour for how well we would work together. And it was really to identify as well internally the changes that were going to be needed to support this way of working. This method is very much in line with Agile projects, that initial phase to assess whether something is viable or not. So we sort of hijacked that for our own purposes. It did go well, but another lesson for me from that was that it probably went on too long. I think we tried to bite off too much in that. It should have been a sort of much more finite, smaller deliverable that we were looking for. But during that time, we worked on the contracts, and as has been said earlier, what we ended up putting in place, which is quite common on lots of IT service contracts, is a framework agreement, which covers all your standard legal T's and C's, and also covered the Agile process and what the responsibilities were on both sides. Underneath that is where we put in a contract specifically for the web development services that we were going to procure. This was much more brief and was written in a way that could be adapted very easily. So if we wanted to change our velocity, support model, or that kind of thing, it was possible to do that with not as much governance as changing the whole contract would be. So we've now been working with that agency in full development mode for a couple of months. Should be releasing our first live sprint next week. And so briefly, in conclusion, we selected fundamentally not based on the view of whether they were going to be agile or not, but we based it on the view that we thought we would be getting a better product. APM isn't an organisation that is that familiar with agile internally, and actually in some respects this worked against them a little bit. We are still pretty early on in our journey to becoming more agile. So I think that the kind of 3 lessons that I would take away from this is that be really clear on that vision up front. I've seen certainly other contracts and other engagements that really just start with a product vision. You need to have that clear and have your stakeholders in agreement on what it is you're actually trying to achieve. Invest time in getting to know your partner. Those getting to know you sessions or chemistry sessions or whatever you want to call them, they're invaluable, and they can really give some great insights. And on the contract side of things, if you feel nervous, do what you can to de-risk that as much as possible. Break it into chunks if that would help, but try not to let it stifle the agile principles of adaptability and being able to fail fast.
Thank you, Will. That's been quite an insight into a real world project there. So now, Olubukola, could you possibly elaborate a little bit on managing and delivering the contract based on your experience in that area?
One of the things to think about when managing the contracts and delivering the work is doing the thinking early. So managing the contract should run throughout the whole process, right from when you're thinking about what the contract is going to deliver, who's going to deliver what, agreeing meetings with stakeholders, when the contract has been agreed, and when it's signed into action. And also, I can't overemphasize collaboration. It's important to just have the thinking out there, talking, having those honest and conversations with feedback, because there's value in following on through actions from meetings with honest feedback, identifying what the key risks will be with the contract, what the issues might be, what the mitigating actions will be, and contingencies as well. Also, in thinking about managing the contract and delivering the work, we need to think about the agile bit of it, not just in the delivery team, but across the piece. The leadership teams, how engaged they are with the contracts, what needs to be agreed on with all throughout the process. And equally important to note is that leadership does not have to be top down, but across all the levels within the stakeholders. Someone within the contract management role might decide or think up something that they consider a risk or an issue or something that might happen later in the delivery of the contract. So it's important to think about nurturing that agile spectrum of the contract delivery. Also, in terms of the ways to agree how the contract is going to be delivered, it's important to think about ways of working, being agile with the infrastructure and the opportunities that it offers. When we think about where we're at right now, we think about not being able to work closely with colleagues and stakeholders, but the opportunity that offers video conferencing, the shared platforms for database information sharing, planning tools, and all the partnering technologies to support efficient working and also to take forward decisions. So collaboration is not just about a one-time thing, it's about continuously making time out to discuss, to look at things that could be improved in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. Also, governance cannot be overemphasized, because governance makes us realize that there's some things that might go wrong as the contract progresses. We need to think about the RAG rating, that's the risks, whether it's a red risk, an amber risk, or green rated risk. So a major risk identified until mitigation is agreed can indicate a red RAG rating, whilst the contract with green RAG rating would indicate stability, and that contract documents are consistently updated with changes, and there's a good working and collaborative relationship between the stakeholders across the piece, the supplier, the contract manager, the project leads, and leadership as well. And also, when the project is ongoing with the contracts being agreed, are we looking at the benefits? Are we logging the benefits as we think they've been coming up? And are we logging on the lessons that we're learning from engagement with the supplier and other stakeholders across the piece? And how are these opportunities and the opportunities that have arisen from the contract manager, how have we logged that on? So that also is involved in the governance of not just the how, but what. What does it involve in engaging with the contracts management procedure and how the relationship across the piece evolves? That's pretty much about managing the contract and delivering the work. John?
Thank you very much, Olubukola. That's been very interesting, and thanks for your insight into collaboration. And now it is a good time. We've got about 5 minutes for questions. In regards to risk appetite, you know, does it mean if you're going to grow into an agile procurement that your organization has to have a particular high level of risk appetite? Who would like to answer that?
Can I answer that? Can I?
Sure.
I think there's a real different slant on this. The traditional procurement and legal view of risk is we get rid of risk by outsourcing it, and therefore it's someone else's responsibility to manage it. And in doing that, you actually reduce your ability to manage it. But ultimately, if that risk happens, your project's late. And if you push that risk away and then it occurs, and then you go, no, I want to manage it, you actually start sticking your finger in, and that's a change under the contract potentially. So you end up paying for it as well after an argument. The other view is, well, actually, these risks occur, and we want to manage them. We want to have influence over them, and therefore we're going to contract in a way which allows us. So part of the risk, wholly or substantially, or will fall on us, and that's a real change in mindset. And it goes back to Jason's point about getting the buy-in from the legal and procurement team and the senior leadership. It's a change in slant. You're managing the risk with your supplier, your provider, rather than just trying to push it away.
And I would add to that, John, that the risk doesn't change. Your appetite for risk and the projects you select is the same. It's the fact that you're identifying it and making it much more collaborative and shared early on.
So I think we've got a couple of minutes just for one more question. Carrots and sticks has come up. Can the panel indicate some typical carrots for agile procurement?
Carrots would be more revenue. So you want to reduce failure demand for a term. You want to make sure that the supplier wants the most efficient amount of energy invested for the most revenue possibly generated. And that means they need to perform and have the right behaviors and participate in decision making. And that's a huge carrot. So I know many projects that I've been involved with, if you're saying to your providing community or your supplier chain, we want to share more, we want to have you closer, we want you to know what we need when we need it, your business development people will bite your hand off. So that means that you're an informed client, a better client, and one that will be a client of choice by your supply chain if they have other people that they're working with. That's a huge carrot in my mind.
Yeah, I'll give you a quick example. Perhaps it's quite a long sprint, as in they were but it was for improvements for that coal mine in New Zealand, so open cast coal mine. As I said, the management staff from the Australian miner were paid at cost effectively. In terms of the carrots, there were 8 main areas, and you could subcategorize them down by which you could evaluate the non-financial, or did it include the financial, the performance of the mine, so environmental, stakeholder, etc. And then they looked down and they could look at things they could measure, and these were weighted, and effectively the bonus, where the money was that the Australian miner got, was based on those weightings. So if there was a problem with a stakeholder during the year, there was no point in saying, well, it was because of you did this or you did that. It was just, well, actually, we want good stakeholders, happy stakeholders. You want to get your bonus, we'll sort it.
Thank you, John. Well, we've now elapsed our time. I'd just like to say thank you to the panel and to all of the audience. I'll just say thank you again.